So we're back. We're back online with this amazing growth webinars from the New Landscape of Growth project. Again, we are here today with my partner in crime, Manfredi Sassoli. Welcome, Manfredi.
Hi there. Good to be here.
And we have two tremendous guests again here today. Yara Paoli, Chief Growth Officer at Colonial and former VP of Growth at Skyscanner. Hello, Yara. Nice to have you with us.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
And Craig Zingerline. I hope that I pronounced it well. Probably not.
Zingerline, close enough.
Zingerline, yeah. I'm always trying not to sound too normal when
I kind of like your pronunciation better.
That's fine. That's great. Founder and CEO at Growth University and six-time founder and former head of Growth and CPO. So thank you very much, Craig, for spending some time with us today. We're looking forward to leverage on both of your experiences. Okay. So let me just share quickly my screen with our. I think this should be with our listeners. Yes. So just a quick recap of where we are with the research and what you can expect next. Today again we are here with Yara and Craig. It's the third episode of our research. This research essentially started by some considerations that we have been taking on growth. Essentially, our thesis, it's the thesis that growth, as in general, marketplaces and platform thinking, is now spilling over every sector. So you really need to master these ideas and these patterns and practices across the board. Everybody needs that because this is a pervasive way of organizing markets and products. So we want to make this very much accessible for everyone and not just for the specialists. So we're basically trying to distill noise from signals from noise, and we're doing that essentially through this process that has been involving several champions that have been sharing their experience directly with us. And we also wrote several essays, and you may have seen the last one that we released just a couple of weeks ago on pricing in platform and marketplaces. We have been talking about growth engines. We have been talking about strategically approaching liquidity, and there is another one coming up soon on metrics that we kind of close the circle and prepare us for consolidation of our guide coming up in the coming months. I will talk about this later on. Then today's agenda, we plan to run this conversation for more or less 1 hour. We're going to have a discussion with these insiders, and if you have questions, please ask them on the YouTube channel. That's the easiest way to do that, or try to in any way, LinkedIn, to comment and to send your question over. There is our teammate Andrea looking after your questions and helping us to gather them and share them with our experts for today. So that's all for now. I will come back to the quick presentation in a few minutes after the conversation. But now the word goes to Manfredi, and I will be here learning with you.
Hi, everyone. I must say, really glad to be here with two people I know pretty well, and with whom I've spoken many times, Yara and Craig, and also two people that kind of, in many ways, do a similar job, but who've had kind of quite different paths. I think, as Simone said, growth is becoming increasingly important, but there are a lot of misconceptions about it, and it's not really necessarily accessible to everyone. And I think today it'd be interesting to understand why that is, and also what are the pillars that make up growth to a certain extent. So to start, I'll actually ask Yara and Craig to tell us how they got to where they are today. What was their career paths? So ladies first. Yara, tell us about you.
Okay. Actually, I think I started, with the the original growth background, because I studied psychology at university. So maybe not very common as a path for growth people or growth hackers, but certainly very helpful in many ways, because of course it's all about understanding people, and growth is understanding the customer and connecting the customer, with the value that your product creates. So I think, I started with that. Clearly, the motivation was different, right? I was meant to be a clinical psychologist, and for a few years, I actually studied in the experimental laboratory of the university. But then again, lots of statistics, lots of methodology of research, which I think came in handy years later. The other thing is that this gave me a lot of insights into people dynamics and organizational dynamics. So in many ways, I reutilized it in my career. But I started actually as a clinical psychologist and doing experimentation, of new therapies with different type of patients. And after that, I studied media and communication, and I had a big passion for music and the music industry. So again, very, very varied background. That's when I started to do a lot of market research and going into marketing to position new radio formats. So I started a bit from that angle, and then I moved on to actually by chance to join an incubator. And that's when I started to actually get really passionate about startups and new business ideas and learning on the ground really how to hack my way through growth. Until obviously I learned the methodologies, the channels, the marketing, and the more complicated business strategies. So I went from these early days of hacking my way into growth to more structured, experiences working as a business development manager, country manager for different companies. I worked in media agencies, and then of course what Simone was mentioning in the beginning, the most popular and probably successful stories of Skyscanner, Preply, and more recently Oda, which is the ex-Kolonial.
Which I believe recently you did a little raise. Is that correct?
Yes. We raised quite a significant capital thanks to Prosus and SoftBank. So we're in a hyper growth moment right now.
Amazing. Well done. Very interesting. Craig, your story is a bit different, correct?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Yara, I'm fascinated by the psychology background because I think there's so much. I mean, user psychology is thrown out there 50 times a day when you're talking to marketers and product people, but it's like you actually studied it. So it's no wonder why I think that foundation was built there and led to some great success. So thrilled to be here, and thanks again for having me on. Yeah, my background is definitely a little bit different, maybe a little less. A little more all over the place, let's just say. So I studied information management in college, which basically meant that I was doing kind of business case studies as well as trying to do programming. And it was kind of like the intersection of those two things, really kind of like as the internet was really starting to take off quite a while ago. I started my career actually building a very small web development agency. And then fairly quickly moved into, and I was on the building side. So I was the web developer and I had a designer with me at that point in time. And then I became a software engineer, so a web software engineer for about 5 years or so. And during that time, I was teaching database and web development classes at a university just outside of Boston. I was doing that on the nights, and I was working at a startup during the day. And I realized relatively quickly that I loved the structural components of like building stuff, but I was not the best at building stuff. And I quickly got surpassed by all my peers in the field and my coworkers. And I realized, well, I love the execution side, but I don't want to be the person doing it. So I got into product management. And so I spent the next few years actually building, one as a failed startup. So first kind of like epic failure happened in kind of the mid 2000s. And then I just had a passion for helping other people kind of realize their vision. And so I spun up my own little agency again. This time it was a little bit bigger, doing kind of bigger projects, web development, getting into product strategy. Then I moved to a larger agency. So the agency was the theme, kind of the first half of my career, where we were building a lot of product strategy and some marketing strategy into basically what were like tech rollouts. So many of the major nonprofits, like in the DC area, like they were customers of ours. So we had kind of these global think tanks and some NGO and a lot of nonprofit based client, and then some startups were kind of our customer base. And that was really the hook for me in terms of, okay, well, we're really good at building all this stuff, but once we build this stuff, what's the next step? All of these clients need customers. They need to understand how to go and get users. They need to understand that lens to look through to actually go and find customers. And that actually led me to get into the kind of the straight up startup space, where I said, well, rather than doing this for a bunch of other places, why don't I come in-house and actually see what this role of building stuff internally while kind of controlling product backlogs and stuff like that, and starting to now be responsible for finding customers was like, and that's where I spent a bunch of time in the Bay Area and then in the DC area. And fast forward, it's basically what I'm doing now. But my model went from entirely kind of technical to like all the way over to the marketing side. I ran large teams at Upside Travel, which is a highly funded travel startup, and then I've bootstrapped stuff. And what I'm doing now, we actually just raised a small round ourselves, and we're now kind of teaching startups how to do growth on their own. Because if you look at the market landscape, it's almost all focused on the individual within the company. So we try to take that holistic startup approach. So that's kind of how I got here.
That's amazing. It's quite a different journey. And I must say, my journey is still a different one in that I graduated in business studies, and I liked marketing because I thought that it was being customer centric was what made companies successful. And I liked data. So then I got into digital marketing, particularly performance marketing. And then I did it for kind of larger and larger companies. I focused in tech companies, doing it for big firms. And then I realized that it was very difficult to sell a bad product. So then I started working with startups, also on the product side, to kind of impact that side. And then with time kind of developed in a kind of a full-fledged growth role. And I think that the fact that there are kind of so many ways into the role also implies clearly that a lot of skills come to play in order to do the job. And it also highlights the complexity of actually doing it, right? Because nobody can know absolutely everything. And I think also that what it means is that effectively, growth has different shapes and sizes also for different companies because they have different challenges, but also because they need to execute in different ways, and they can execute in different ways because also no company has all the skills, particularly early on. So I know that both of you guys have worked for large companies, but also for younger kind of startups. What do you find are the kind of common misconceptions about growth that firms have?
I guess I'll take this one first. I mean, I think a lot of companies hear growth and it's kind of become a buzzword, and they don't really know what it is. And they try to kind of ride the wave of like growth, but they maybe don't understand like how many moving pieces there actually are to fill. And if you don't have a team, it's really hard to do like all of the proper things that you should be doing as growth. So maybe you should focus on like acquisition, a component of growth, or perfecting your product to make your product better so that you can, when you get it in front of people, you don't have a retention problem, for example. So I'd say like kind of maybe just a lack of awareness of, because there's so many pathways in, as you mentioned, Manfredi, and then because there's so many different shapes and sizes of growth and growth teams, I just don't think there's even a common nomenclature or structure. So that would probably be a misconception that I see often.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with you, Craig. I think there are a lot of misconceptions about growth, but the main one really derives by the fact that nobody seems to have a clear definition of the word, right? Because growth really means a lot of things. But the more traditional companies define growth as just growth in revenue. And then, probably people that come from the startup world define growth as this fancy, cool, trendy term that defines crossings between product and marketing and analytics. And it's very much overlap with then the other term that is growth hacking, which obviously has at the core rapid experimentation. And on top of that, we complicate things because we also call it growth marketing sometimes. And then you wonder what's the difference with marketing. So, and then I think more recently we added on top the growth product concept, which, of course, if we dig deeper, and we want to take the time, we can define them and differentiate them. But I think all these new fancy terms that came up in the last probably, 10 years, something like that. Unless you really work with it and you have the chance to deeply think it through and then operationalize it, they're just probably I would say a surface concept that you mainly use for recruitment purposes rather than actually delivering a sustainable long-term growth, as I think it should be.
So fundamentally what we're saying is that the base of growth is a process that enables sustainable growth for a company. Is that what we're getting to?
If I can take this, since I mentioned these terms, I would say so. I mean, at least that's the way I interpret it, right? For me, it's really, growth is really an operating system. It's not a hack. That needs to be clear. It's an operating system that you build in your startup or scale up, or can even be a more mature company that allows your people to efficiently and systematically deliver growth. And the type of growth we're talking about is probably sustainable, defensible, very often, compounding type of growth, which inevitably leads to a long-term growth scenario.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think just back to some of the definitions, I mean, one of the roles that I had was a head of growth role, but it was really just a head of performance marketing. Right. So, but then there was also a marketing team. So what's the marketing team doing? If I'm doing the head, and then finally we realized we have to just, the whole thing is growth. Right. And there were some traditional marketing roles, like maybe some of the content production and content strategy and stuff like that. And then there were, growth leads who do experiments. So, I mean, it's all over the map. And so I think the definitions is tricky, but I will completely agree also with Yara on it can't really be a bunch of hacks. You can use some channel tactics and some growth tactics and sometimes you need to do that. But if you're, the analogy that I often use is if you're selling a product that you can't get above water on in terms of the cost that it takes to acquire a customer, you can't really build a business. You can't build a long-term sustainable business because you're not profitable. And at some point you need to be profitable, which, most of the high growth, early stage Silicon Valley based companies aren't profitable, and they don't need to be because they continuously raise money. But at some point as a founder, you have to wrap your arms around, well, that sustainable growth has to support a real business, and that real business needs to be around for a long time.
And so we've spoken about big companies and kind of younger companies. How does growth differ in these companies? Is growth different in a startup? Should they start on day one, or should they only think about it after a certain stage? What's your view, Craig?
Yeah, so I do think it's different. I think when you have a bigger team and more resources, you can split people into areas of focus that that they can go and dig in and spend time on. Should growth be a focus of day one? Yeah, whether or not you call it growth or not. Like, I don't think you have a business if you don't understand how you're going to get customers. I can't tell you how many founders I talk to who ask me how to go raise money for their idea, and I ask about traction and they don't have any, and then I ask about how are they currently thinking about getting customers, and they're not thinking about how they're going to go and get customers. And so that's an example of, I would say, what not to do. Like, yes, you should start with growth from day one. And I would say day one starts when it's not when you've got the product. The product is probably day 100 or day 200. Like, you have to start that growth mindset, that go-to-market strategy, that thinking, that experimentation. Once you've burned through talking to your family and everybody, your friends are telling you to stop talking about this idea, from then on out, you really need to think about, okay, well, how am I going to systematically go after customers and start to build that playbook? So I would say yes. And it does differ based on company stage, because in the early days, it might just be you and a co-founder. So it's the two of you doing literally everything, including running the business. So it changes radically over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you, Craig. I maybe sometimes when I get asked that question about when should I start a growth team, normally that means when I should start adopting, let's say, growth hacking methodology, or actually building teams that I can call growth, that fall are cross-functional, operating on lean principles, running experimentation. What I would say is that the key differentiator is having product market fit or not. Although, of course, that's not a binary concept. Normally, we can simplify saying, you probably don't need a growth team pre-product market fit, because all you need to focus on is actually on finding the right product for the right market, and you focus on quality and qualitative research. And then, of course, growth in a way requires certain amount of traffic to experiment with, and to be able to reach that speed of learning that is typical of, let's say, startups that are post PMF. So that's a bit the only thing that I would spell out a bit differently.
Makes sense. And then, of course, when you say to people, do you want to grow as a company? Everybody says yes, right? Do you like growth? Obviously. Do you like sustainable growth? Obviously. But the trick is, unfortunately, it's not that easy to achieve that in practice, right? And so what does one achieve it? How do you go about creating this? So say that, you are a startup, you've achieved your product market fit, you have some money in the bank. What do you do? Where would you go? How do you start creating a growth team in your experience?
I can try to answer. I mean, what I would do, or let's say a little bit the method that I apply, if we are, let's say, post product market fit, potentially means that I've got a clear idea of the problem that my product wants to solve, right? Or the needs that I'm creating for my customers. That in a way leads to having a clear definition of retention, and what does it mean, and what does it take to experience core value of your product. And therefore, you can start really digging into a bit the data and analyzing backwards, the customers that I've got that are more engaged, that have reached that longer term retention, and work your way backwards to define maybe other metrics that matter for you. And in doing so, normally you would also be able to define your metrics tree, for which you can spot, the biggest growth opportunity, mapping, from the North Star metric down, all the growth lever and the KPIs that you can leverage really to deliver that type of impact in your North Star metric. I tend to have a data-driven approach to team building. So normally I would typically do a growth funnel analysis and an analysis of constraints to understand what are the biggest growth opportunities and the biggest blockers to growth, and then build teams that are prioritizing those opportunities. very often this coincides with starting maybe with the typical activation team that works on onboarding and, obviously making sure that the new customers that you acquire experience that core value as fast and as efficiently as possible, because we know that has a bigger impact on then the retention curve, right? So that is a logical one, but it's always good to check your metrics and then build a team around that. Also, because normally when you're a startup, it's not that you have an abundance, right, of people and talent. So you really need to make sure that you're focused and you prioritize correctly.
Yeah, all really awesome points. I agree with all of it. I think the one way to frame it up as well is, and again, this depends on your capital state, but if you understand kind of that persona solution fit, and you're kind of at that product market fit stage where there's some repeatability in what you're doing to get customers, then often what you're going to look at is a little bit more tactical around kind of channel exploitation. So like, what channels are big channels that we can go and we can win in, and how do we get started, and who do we need to get started with that? And then so you talk about kind of like, well, what are the resources needed to be successful in that channel, and running organic SEO strategy against, say, a referral based or a pure product led strategy are going to be fairly different composures of even the people within those teams doing the work. One thing that I've done, I would say successfully in the past with smaller teams, kind of smaller but growing teams. So in a situation where you've got some budget and you've got some people, but you're going to be hiring and you're going to be building that out, is effectively put a lead on each of the main metrics that you're tracking. And usually it kind of follows the pirate metrics, right? You're going to have somebody has to own revenue and retention. And maybe that's going to be the same person, because you can't do short-term revenue tactics if they negatively impact retention 3 months down the road. And then to Yara's point, like maybe it's an activation person or an activation team. Maybe it's a paid acquisition lead, and maybe it's an organic acquisition lead. And you give them ownership and responsibility and autonomy to go and build out the programs that they need to build out, and you give them the space and time to do that, and then you kind of get out of their way. So that's one way that I've approached it, kind of at that, like, you've got some sense of product market fit, you've got some budget, but it's not yet a huge team.
Yeah.
Manfredi, can I jump in quickly for one point? So I'm curious to have you cover some practical heuristics and advice that you can share from your past experience, and most specifically, I'm interested in from what I perceive from the conversation. What I perceive is that it's always a contextual thing. You really need to understand every product is different. Every context is different. But what are the things that tend to work all the time? So what because the other point that I wanted to make is that it feels like there is a moment where growth switches from a very creative and strategic work into very tactical. It's like really getting growth happen. It was funny when I was listening to this podcast, this conversation between Brandon Chu and well, now I don't remember the name, but it was a former CMO, Craig. I don't remember the surname, but a former CMO and CPO of Shopify, and he said we had this amazing product and people didn't know about that. So the idea was really getting people to use the product, and so I felt this really this really practical thing and tactical thing of really getting people to use the product. So what are these heuristics that you using all the time, or approaches that have been working across the board in terms of really getting care of these tactical and practical issue of getting people to use a product as evidently has a product, let's say a user product fit, but not the market yet. So what are these, if there is any?
I'll take that one. I mean, it's hard to say what works all the time, but if I had to place my bets somewhere, let's say you're looking at a company to invest in or to advise, right? What you generally want to see, or if you're going to be joining an early stage startup, you want to see that there's a sense of consistency around some kind of top of funnel or awareness level strategy that's working, right? And if I had to put my money somewhere, it would probably be on paid acquisition, actually, because your ability to go and find your feedback cycle is very, very fast when you're spending money to get your product in front of people. And you're going to probably fail faster and learn more quickly than if you're going purely organic, which not everybody agrees with. But I would look at some kind of performance marketing, whether it's basically Google or Facebook, maybe supplemented with some other channels, right? I mean, that's basically what we have. And then the next layer down is I call it an EPAG metric, so an endpoint acquisition goal metric, which is it's the conversion point between, it's a handoff really between traditionally what marketing go on kind of lead gen or acquisition and then usage of the product. So that might be a free trial or a demo form or a download, or you get somebody's email. And in the next step, I mean, to Yara's point earlier around kind of that first engagement that the user has with the product, that early stage of onboarding, kind of post-acquisition, now they become a user, become a customer, you have to connect that value. And the stuff that works all the time is when you understand what that proxy is to provide longer term, like the proxy to longer term retention is some activity, it's some action, it's something that the user is doing in the product, because retention is a lagging indicator. You're not going to know what your retention is for months, maybe not years, right? Especially in an infrequent marketplace, it takes a long time to determine that. Mm-hmm. So the stuff that works all the time is finding the top of funnel that's going to work through iteration and testing, and then making sure that you understand what that key action that you need the user to take is, and then kind of relentlessly focusing on making that experience to that value faster.
I can confirm, what Craig is saying, and actually I can add a couple of practical examples. Certainly, both at Skyscanner and Preply, what we did was definitely to play a lot with paid advertising to acquire, in the first case, obviously travelers, and in the second, students or tutors, because obviously that was a marketplace. To validate the product, but we were actually looking for that leading indicator that tells us if a customer, will be most likely be retained in the longer term. For Skyscanner, just to give you the example I was talking about, that was actually making a search. So if we could get a new traveler that was landing on, let's say, our homepage, to do the first search, that was the most single important behavior that would lead to actually the experience of value. Because of course, once you do a search of a flight from a city to another, then you would see the full search results, right? And that's when you have what typically gets called the aha or wow moment, and you realize, what the product can do for you. So these two things, finding the right customer through the right targeting and then getting them to experience that, is the two things that you should always try to do.
Yeah, just maybe underlining this for our listeners, Manfred, I think this is important. This idea of the leading indicator that is not talked much normally. So I understand from Craig's and Yara's point that the idea is spending money on paid advertising, paid acquisition, but be able to understand first and early what is this leading indicator that is predicting long-term life value from the customer. So retention. And one thing that maybe we can also remind is this idea that as the customers invest their time into the product, this tends to be a good leading indicator for long-term commitment to the product. So if you get somebody to, for example, doing a wish list or doing search, as you said, but committing time into the product, then it's a good indicator that you will be stuck in the product for the longer term. So these are some things that I thought it was important to highlight for our listeners.
And I find it very interesting that sometimes these key performance indicators are not tied to revenue, right? Even if sometimes they're more important than revenue. And so, what I've seen is that like a key skill that is needed is the ability to create some kind of business modeling or growth modeling that guides your operations. Yara earlier mentioned a kind of metrics tree, also called kind of growth models. And I think, to kind of what I take from what you guys have said is that often, in many cases, a few of the key skills that are required to build a kind of initial growth machines are some kind of growth modeling and KPI setting skills. And finding the right KPI is not obvious sometimes. Data analysis, kind of some customer understanding / psychology, marketing skills, and deep channel expertise on performance channels. I think that's quite often a good package to start with.
Yeah. I would add on that, Manfred, if you allow me, because you mentioned, that the debate between optimizing for revenue and for retention in a way, that is part of the heuristics that Simone was asking about, because it's a mistake that very common gets done by certain founders or certain marketeers, that you want to optimize for the short-term gain to show that you're actually delivering and that you are increasing the revenue. But revenue not necessarily goes with the user value and a great experience, not all the time, because you can obviously trick and put in place a lot of things to increase revenue in the short term, like adding an additional generator through display advertising. That is not core part of the product. And I wanted to share an example of learnings that we've done at Skyscanner. So I was mentioning the search as being one of these leading indicators to core product value. But in the early days of Skyscanner, we didn't only have the search panel. We also had below the search some ticks that we used to call something like find alternatives, I think. And basically what these were pre-checked boxes that would pop under, that were integrated with the alternatives to the flights that we were showing, powered by online travel agents, or let's say other partners that maybe were paying us a lot of money, right, just to be shown there.
Yeah, I bought some of those ads back in the day.
So this for us was a tremendous revenue generator. But then we found out that not necessarily they were playing in favor of a good experience of the customer, and they were actually playing a negative role on longer term retention, because customers would go out of our properties and find the alternatives maybe quicker, but somewhere else. So we actually took a very hard choice to remove them, and losing, hundreds of thousands of pounds, to actually make sure that we could build a better experience for the customer. And that in the longer term paid off in terms of increasing our retention rate.
Since we're on the travel subject, so I was head of growth at Upside Business Travel, and we had this metric that was most accurately tied to retention, which was around your experience when you're on a trip and you need to make a change. So this is for business travel. You need to make a change, and the process was magical. You can text our agents or pick up the phone, and we could even predict when delays were going to happen, and we could reroute you and things like that. That's not even an in-product experience, right? That's like an in the real world experience that was a leading indicator of retention and then future revenue. So, I mean, that was so far removed from the experience of like looking for and searching for flights and hotel rooms and then booking and adding to cart and then like getting the upcoming trip reminders. This was like, you have a problem, and the core value that we solve for is that we're the place to go when you've got a problem that comes up on the trip, and we'll make your life much easier, much faster. And it was such a lagging indicator, and sometimes it never happened because you didn't have a problem. But if you did, we knew you'd stick around.
And I think it's interesting because on one hand, the growth process, it's about being ruthlessly data-driven and about fast experimentation, which requires great executional skills. On the other, all this needs to kind of mirror real-world value creation, which then means that you need to understand user psychology, the value proposition of the product, and therefore overlay all the different other kind of skills, which is complex. And so in order also to do that, you need kind of a lot of collaboration between different parties and different teams. And my light is kind of going crazy here. Sorry, guys. And so you need to kind of have a lot of collaboration between teams. And that also means a great culture, or at least the right culture. How do you achieve that? And what does the right culture look like for growth?
I guess I'll take a stab at that one first. I think you need entrepreneurial people in the driver's seat who are also empathetic. You know, I think where a lot of growth teams go wrong is when they kind of get ahead of themselves a little bit and are doing unsustainable things that maybe are damaging to the company long term in order to get some short-term gains. And I think that, like, from a cultural standpoint, the company, first of all, company leadership needs to, I think, enable a culture of experimentation and allow a culture of experimentation through giving people the autonomy to go and do the things that they need to do to kind of prove out the model. But then at the user level or at the human level, like, somebody needs to just make sure that whatever's happening is done for the right reasons and that there is actual value being created. And you know, if you look at it through that lens, then you're going to avoid a lot of the problems that you see with some of the high growth startups that you constantly read about in the news for toxic and bad workplaces, right? So
makes sense.
Yeah, I can give you my 2 cents as well. I think when I imagine, you know, the best possible culture normally is made of very few ingredients. And definitely there is an element of empathy, as Craig has mentioned, you know, that is super important because obviously everybody wants to be understood, wants to be listened. And, you know, that creates obviously an engagement that is necessary and functional to any delivery and any execution. And the leaders that forget about this because they are in a hurry, because they're eager to earn money or grow, you know, I think, you know, they commit a big mistake. But the second aspect, which seems quite banal, but actually is very, very difficult to maintain, especially with scale, is clarity of direction. And that doesn't mean only having a very clear objective and the problem that your product is solved, but actually making sure that you have a crystal clear communication system that makes everybody feel part of the mission. And obviously, the more you grow and the faster you do it, the more complicated it becomes to keep everybody informed, everybody in the loop, and make them feel part of something bigger than them and something that they want to belong to. I think, you know, great cultural leaders have this very, very clear in mind. And then the third element, which I think very recently became, again, very popular and was coined by Professor Amy Edmondson, is psychological safety, which is very much linked to a growth mindset. And that is about, you know, you being able or feeling safe in showing that you are vulnerable in front of others, being capable of admitting that you make a mistake, and therefore being able to learn from it. And that is basically the same foundation of experimentation and A/B testing, right? You need to prove yourself wrong, not right. And obviously, if you enable this mindset in a way through a psychologically safe environment, I think you then have the right culture that can foster sustainable growth.
Yeah, and I think that's why I love growth so much, because in a way, so the kind of the North Star metric, which then leads the whole growth model, effectively is the reflection in a metric of the mission of the firm. And so it has a very deep purpose. And then that kind of psychological safety is also, I think, leads to the not having fear to fail, because you can't have that if you are about testing. And then finally, I think that like growth is also personal growth, which also kind of professional growth, and we all constantly need to be learning because the whole landscape constantly evolves. And so, and I think that's also exciting, right? In a job, I think everybody wants to keep on learning effectively. And I guess that's partly why we're all here today.
That's fascinating as well, because we had James Currier here a few weeks ago, and he was making the point that you really need this commando approach, that to some extent sounds a bit different from what you guys are highlighting. And I think it relates with the stages of growth as well. No? So it's really about what you need at the start. There's much more commitment to you really make it work. And then on the second stage, on a later stage, this idea that you really need to have a team and many teams. And it's also a very important point. How do you give, for example, direction to the many teams? How do you distribute, for example, the leading indicators to all the teams, that then fit into a more complete, let's say, chain of performance. But one thing that I wanted to also, because we have people on the YouTube that are asking questions, I wanted to drop one quick question as we move towards the end of the conversation, if Manfred, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One interesting thing is we got a couple of questions. One was about what is the relevant feedback loop that indicates the right growth, which I think is interesting, especially if we look also into the second question that we got, that it was about defining a good retention rate. And I want to connect that with some considerations on, growing in the right way. Now, I listened recently to a podcast with Alissa Ravasio, if I'm not wrong, from the CEO of HipCamp, where she described how in an early stage of the company, they opened up essentially the marketplace in that case basically they started to have people that were leasing, not really outdoor spaces, but maybe some RVs that were just parked around in the highways, and that was really not doing well for the brand. So it was also impacting the perception of the customers and the community. So how do you get the right growth on board? And especially as you think about marketplaces, you may also have this problem of supply and demand. Who do you focus first? But in general, the consideration around feeling that you're growing in the right way, that the suppliers that you're onboarding, for example, are, or the customers that you're onboarding are the right ones. How do you, if you have anything to add on this, especially in the context of marketplaces, of course, but more generally, how do you feel like that the growth is the right one?
I mean, I think that you're going to hear it from your customers, right? So like what I think you want to, you can look at metrics and you can, at scale, you're going to have all sorts of different indicators and bells and whistles around predicting where the right kind of growth is going to come from. But I think, and on the metric side, you can look at channels and channel distribution, and then retention by channel, retention by campaign, retention by customer segment. There's a million ways to do that. But I think what you want to find is that you're solving a real problem for a person, and you're able to, when you solicit feedback, or hopefully you're getting feedback, hopefully you're hearing from people both about what they like and what they don't like. The danger zone is when you're not hearing anything, when you're not adding enough value for somebody to love it, but it's not bad enough where they're churning and they're saying something, or they churn and they don't say something, and you can't really learn from that, right? So I think, this is super qualitative. There's no data behind this, but I think it's like when you as a founder, you kind of know when you're onto the right thing, because it feels right, because you're hearing things from customers that are actually using the product, and they're sharing you with others, and they're sharing a part of their day or a part of their experience with you back in the form of feedback. And sometimes that comes mostly in the earlier days from the early adopters, but even at scale, like if you have those feedback loops open, I think that's a good way to kind of, from a qualitative standpoint, understand how much value you're providing is by both talking to users and then systematizing how you capture feedback from those users.
And to add, Yara, otherwise.
Yeah, no, I would say the most basic one is indeed about word of mouth and, customer talking about your product, which is a bit of a paradox, no? Because normally it's really tricky to measure, but it's something that you really feel and you hear when you're launching a product, right? The reviews that are out there are not kind of mad, but they're actually good, and customers do the acquisition work on your behalf. So that is the simplest and probably most obvious sign that you're doing something right. Then, of course, if you want to know if you're growing in the right way, there are a set of metrics or a combination of metrics that you can look into. And for sure, seeing if customers come back, in the banal form of they try it once and then they come back, depending on the natural frequency of your product, is another. And then, in your core metrics in general, if you analyze your growth over a period of time, you should see something between 3 and 4x kind of growth, right? So all the products that are growing well, that are finding the product market fit, normally see this type of patterns, I would say. And then again, one important indicator. Sorry, Manfred, you want to
go ahead.
One of the important indicators, since we were talking about the importance of paid marketing, not to actually acquire the first customer fast, is also that I think good growth also comes with good monetization. And a lot of startups, have done the mistake to leave that behind and test if actually customers are willing to pay for the value that they're getting. And you don't want to be in a position where you find out that they're not, and you're already short on funding or that kind of stuff. And it's very, very common. No, it's one of the, I think, most frequent causes of failure of startups. So making sure that when you run paid campaigns, you've got a decent ROI is also, a very simple but super important indicator.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. So basically, you guys are telling us you need to have empathy for the customer, you need to talk with the customers, and you need to be sustainable and trying to have an ROI. So really getting real, it's really, I think, a good indication.
I will add one more thing. You need to know who the customer is. I think as, having the right kind of growth means, I think, not just having your numbers go up, but having that happen in a sustainable, consistent way. Then it means that you're not just kind of selling your product, but you're really selling it to people for which it really solves a problem. And when you unlock that, then you know which problem you're solving for which people, right? And then you can kind of narrow in to your messaging, your value proposition, your targeting, and then that will then unlock further growth. That's helpful.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating in this growth research of the last months, how much we have been pushed to make it clear that you really need to understand your customer, and you need to understand also the channels that the customers are, where your customers are, and the willingness to pay of your customer. You really need to understand if you are doing well for your customers, essentially. So I think a lot of people think about growth without thinking too much about their customers, and also the flywheels that their customers are embedded in. So this idea that you really need to understand how you're adding value, how the things are working in the inner working of the product and the experience of the customer is really an important point that is coming up all the time. So Manfredi, maybe we have time for a last question, and then maybe we can go towards the closure.
So there's a couple of things I was curious about, and Craig, I might put you on the spot there a little bit, but I was wondering, so you're running currently a growth course. Where do your students come from? Because I'm also kind of curious about finding out kind of the state of growth in the US versus Europe versus maybe Asia. And actually, Yara has maybe some insight on Asia. I'd love to hear about that if you have anything you can share.
Yeah, I mean, so we're a very early stage company. So I mean, our, you know, where we may end up in a couple of years in terms of where our customers are may be really different. But I've been actually
students, right?
As students, yeah. So our students. So what's been fascinating is that roughly 50% of our audience, of our students, has been international so far. It's dipped a little bit below that. It's probably at 30%. If I had to look at recent cohorts, probably 30 to 35%, but it's significant. And what it's told me is that the desire of startups to kind of understand growth holistically, like kind of a lot of the themes that we're talking about, is really there. So a lot of founders now know about growth, but they just don't really know enough, or they don't have the experience yet to understand how to get started. And that's kind of what we do. We help them do that. We help them build that playbook. So our students are primarily US, but we have a really healthy EU contingency. We've got people from the Middle East. We've got people from Asia. Like it's been really fascinating to see. And now we had started as only running live cohort based programs. And we're still doing live cohort programs, but we're moving. Our experiment right now is we're likely going to do it twice a year. We talked to customers and we ran polls on our customers, on our students. And they told us that they prefer more on-demand style, right? So we're experimenting with more on-demand content because not everybody wants to attend live. So that may change the demographic again in the geolocations and when and how and where people are consuming our content. So it's been fairly distributed from day one. Interestingly enough,
I saw a big smile from Yara at one point. I was wondering.
No, I mean, I was just fascinated by the narration. But I think in my past 2 years, I've also developed a set of workshops now with my, let's say, private company called Growth OS. And if we talk about teaching growth, I guess in my case, and being mainly based in Europe in this time, my customers were coming all from, Northern Europe, some of them from Spain and Italy, but a lot of them were coming from Asia, mainly also because I lived in Asia for quite a few years. And that's when I started to collaborate, very closely also with the China Accelerator and MOX, who are obviously collaborating with the SOSV American fund. And the way they think about growth is not necessarily so explicit, in the terminology, in spelling out the methodologies, but in actually doing. I find the speed of thought and an excellence in execution in many Asian companies that are quite unique and probably even more advanced, if you allow me to dare to say this, than a lot of US companies, although it's not so well known. I'm thinking about companies like Grab, for example, in Singapore, or Tokopedia in Indonesia, or again, Property Guru also in Singapore, or Gojek in Indonesia, which I think became a very, very popular success story. So these guys, they were really nailing it in terms of growth, but not necessarily, calling it explicitly like that. So it really depends. Again, you go down to the definition of growth and how, a culture brings you also to interpret growth and to follow the trends, or, anticipate a trend and not even knowing it. But it's about getting stuff done and getting results at the end of the day, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And also definitely growth is not marketing. It goes beyond that, and so I think it's I think it's key, because I mean, from my understanding, tell me if I'm wrong, when you have this conversation with companies, you tend to have kind of to interface yourself with kind of people right at the top, with senior leadership, in order for it to be effective. Is that fair to say?
100%. I mean, if you don't enable that culture of growth, then you can't really do growth, right? You can't really focus on it. You won't have the room and space to kind of experiment. And really, you need at least some space and autonomy and time. And if you've got some money as well, that helps.
True.
Absolutely. And I would say that it's also very important to have a total or nearly total buy-in from the co-founders, right? And leadership, because if they don't buy into growth and the concept, then it's not just a typical battle between growth and product, but also with yourself, let's say, and everything that you set yourself up to.
Yeah. Awesome, guys. Thanks so much. It's been such a nice chat.
Thank you so much. I mean, again, really, the impression that we have is that trying to wrap your head around growth as a founder, but not just even not in ultra scalable digital products, also in more traditional products. It's really, I mean, services, for example, it's really a good way to really, transcend the idea that things will work out. It's really about measuring and giving yourself the right pace into, identifying what to do, the steps, and measuring what happens. So I think it's really important for founders to understand that, as Craig from not you, Craig, sorry, but the Craig from Shopify that I was mentioning before, he said, it's really about getting users to use your products. So otherwise, you can have the best products in the world, but then if nobody uses them, it's not going to work. So thanks so much. I'm going to just use 1 minute to share the screen again to remind our listeners that we're going to come back with some more content later on. So stay tuned for a blog post coming up later in May on Mavericks, and in June we're going to have Josh Brenninger also joining us, and in June we'll be starting to publish the excerpts from the guide, and the first training session is going to come up in the fall. So stay tuned with the work, and again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course, I pushed the wrong button. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time again, and your wise insights. Again, thank you so much, Manfredi.
Again,
all good.
All good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.